so that you can get an idea about the approach to learning and the approach to assessment, and how that. I still see some people say they can't hear. Is that true? We can hear. Somebody said we can hear, and somebody said no sound. Everything is okay. Okay, thank you. So we're going to we're going to talk about the testing in terms of the skills, the 4 skills. So listening, speaking, reading, and writing, but also looking at other skills. So there's a question there, how many skills are there? Is the 4 skills all there is, or are there other elements that we want to test? And that moves into a description and the definition of traits. So traits are really smaller units of language or language proficiency, and these sometimes come under skills and sometimes not. So what are traits, and how do we test them? And the focus then is on integrated skills. So not just testing single skills alone, but how can we test skills together? And what are the benefits of that? Okay, so what we're trying to look at here is how this approach to language testing benefits the student, benefits the teacher, and has a positive impact on learning. A lot of what we're talking about is technology. So we're looking at computer-based testing, but also AI. So I want to really define what artificial intelligence means for Pearson. So how do we use artificial intelligence in the assessment of students? And what are the benefits of that? And also, what are the limitations? So how is it helpful to us as teachers and also as learners and as testers? But also, what are the limitations of those approaches? And then looking at the future, how will technology shape language testing and language learning in the future? So those are the main areas that I want to look at. So thinking about skills and what we mean by skills, and how many skills there are. Now, traditionally, in terms of testing and also in terms of learning, we think of 4 skills: reading, listening, speaking, and writing. But when we're measuring, and often we use those channels to test people and to gauge their language proficiency. But in fact, when we're measuring language proficiency, we are only actually measuring one thing, and that is somebody's language proficiency or language ability. So there's really a single measure which you can then break down into those 4 skills. But how you do that is actually quite important. Now, when we're measuring this single measure of language proficiency, we use a lot of separate measures to make up that language proficiency. As you can imagine, language proficiency is not just a single facet. It's made up of many, many different attributes, and that's what we have within a language test, and that's what we do in terms of the classroom. And these separate measures, these smaller measures, we call traits. So when we're measuring language proficiency, we measure a number of different traits, and then these traits, they amalgamate and they combine to give you that single measure of language proficiency. So a trait, simply put, is a quality that makes one person or thing different from another. So this is a little maths test. So see if you can add up. If you add up the following, so add up those scores for the different skills, and then you get, well, it's there anyway, the total score. But what does that mean? So if we think about this is the common way in which languages are often tested. So either they might be tested as separate papers, or you may have a single paper, but within it you have separate sections which test these kind of areas. So it's very commonplace for tests to be divided in terms of skills. But if you think about a listening paper, and think about the questions in that listening paper, then often it will require you to do other things apart from listen. So, for example, if you are doing a listening test, very often you have to read the questions. At a lower level, like an A level of the Common European Framework, there may be pictures. It may be relatively simple language. But at higher levels of proficiency, intermediate, then the text that the test taker or the student has to read can be quite complex. And understanding the answer to the question may rely as much on what you hear as what you read. Similarly, in listening tests, you may have to write. Obviously, write down the answers may not be a particularly difficult writing skill, but still accurate writing is required, because often if you misspell or you actually put the wrong word there, then you will lose marks. So it may be called listening, but it involves reading and often writing. Reading, similarly, often involves writing. Even though if you have a whole paper on multiple choice, then maybe you don't have to do any writing. But those types of tests are few and far between. Most reading skills tests require you to write the answer. Similarly, a writing test, most writing tests have a prompt, which you have to read. Some writing tests have extensive amounts of reading, which you have to summarize. Now, this is not a surprise. Speaking is another good example. In a speaking test, a lot of the speaking test is listening, and you have to listen to the content in order to respond to it. Now, it's not surprising that these elements are in the test, but there's no real credit given. So when you get your speaking score, that's a score that you believe is for speaking, even though you have spent half the test listening and responding appropriately with the answers that you think that the examiner wants you to say. So the total score, 71, this is the most accurate score of them all, because it combines all of the things that you've done on that test. It combines all the listening, speaking, reading, and writing that you've done. But the part scores, the skill scores, are not really accurate representations of how good your speaking is, for example, or how good your listening is. Because as I say, that listening score of 15 doesn't take into account any of the things that you've performed and showed when you did the speaking test. Similarly, 71, it is the most meaningful score, but at the same time, it may not have any meaning. 71 may be the lowest score. If you've got a class of 20 people, it may be the lowest score in the class. Or similarly, 71 may be the highest score. So what we do and what other major testers do is have calibrated items. So the items that we have, we know the difficulty of, and we calibrate them. And then that score of 71 becomes more meaningful because we can say something about it in terms of where it is on the Common European Framework, or where it is on a scale like the scale we use on most of our tests, the global scale of English. So with calibrated items, then you can make inferences about what that total score means. But still, in this traditional model, the skill scores are not really very meaningful. So how do we deal with this? And you may not be surprised that the way is, as I was saying earlier, we're looking not just at skills, but at traits. So here, and I apologize slightly for the complex nature of the diagram, but I think it actually does illustrate the point I'm making well. What you've got at the top, it says at the top 3 skills. So in fact, this is a placement test. This is called level, and it's a placement test that Pearson produced. You can either take it in 3 skills version or a 4 skills version. So the 3 skills is listening, reading, and writing, and the 4 skills adds speaking. And you can see the red lines underneath indicate speaking. Now the boxes at the top, and the boxes at the bottom, these are all item types. So the item types have been developed so that some of them just test a single skill. So for example, if you look at the first item type, that is just testing vocabulary. And some of them test multiple skills. So if you look at the next to last item on the top row where it says HOTS, that one is hotspots. That's testing, listening, and reading. So some of the items are single skill and some of the items are integrated skills. Now, all of the items contribute to the overall score. But the items that are just have a single skill, they contribute just to that trait or sub-skill. But items that have two skills, they contribute to both skills. And you can see on the bottom with the speaking questions, they are contributing to speaking and reading, listening and reading, just speaking, listening and speaking. So a lot of listening is accounted for in those speaking questions, because most of the speaking questions require us to listen and respond. So this approach, what we're doing here, at the center point, you can see you've got the vocabulary, grammar, and the 4 skills, and also the overall score. So this approach is maximizing the information we have about the student's competence across all those different questions and how it bears on those particular skills and traits. So that approach in general is called multi-item, multi-trait. So you're using a number of items. In the case of that placement test level, it has 17 different item types. And you will get different numbers of those items. Those are just the item types. There's not 17 questions. There's probably 50 or more questions, but based on those 17 item types. And it's measuring multi-trait. So it's not just measuring the skills. So it does measure listening, reading, speaking, and writing. And that diagram was showing you how that works. But it's also looking at other skills. So it's looking at grammar and vocabulary. And in terms of grammar, it's looking at the range of grammar and the correctness, the accuracy of the grammar that's used. Similarly with vocabulary, it's looking at the range of vocabulary, how much do you know, and also how well you can use it. In terms of pronunciation, it's looking at fluency. How well do you speak? How, do you pause? Do you pause inappropriately? Do you pause with silences for a long period of time? And how well do you pronounce individual phonemes, so individual sounds, but also stress and intonation? So when we're looking at the detail of people's speaking and looking at the detail of people's writing, then we're looking at a trait level. What are the building blocks, and how well are the test takers doing those? And then they're built up into that bigger picture. Similarly for writing, coherence and cohesion will be traits that are tracked within the writing competence, and orthographic conventions, capitalization, full stops, paragraphing. So the use of the conventions of writing, which impacts greatly on how the quality of a particular piece of writing. So the benefits of this is that we're looking across the skills, and we are capturing more information about the student's language proficiency. And this integrated skills testing skills together, has benefits in that it's more realistic. I mean, from an assessment perspective, it's not common to see integrated skills in tests. Some tests have it, a number of prominent tests have it, but it isn't common across all tests. Whereas in the classroom, it's very common indeed. So in terms of a teacher's approach to teaching reading, for example, or teaching listening, or any number of skills, teachers will often integrate skills in order to have more effective and more meaningful learning. So, for example, you may want students to talk about something, but before that, you give them something to read so that they have more information, or so they're better briefed. But in reading that task, they are engaging in terms of language strategies of comprehension. And then when they're asked to produce language, they're using the comprehension that they've had to understand what they've read. And they're using that in order to inform or tell somebody about what it was that they've read. So having this integrated approach to testing is much more meaningful for the students, and also reflects what they're doing in the classroom. So, again, this is commonplace that, we read something and then write something, or we read something and say something, or we listen to some information and then we tell somebody else what that was, or we listen to something and then we write down something that you know, to pass on that message. This is you know, communicative language learning based on meaning. So combining the skills in that way is actually much more meaningful to the students, rather than having it in silos and having the, you know, this is a speaking test, but it doesn't relate to the other skills that you're going to use. Authenticity is important, so we try our best to maintain a level of authenticity. Again, the integrated skills testing helps that, in that we can set the communicative context, the real-time production of language. So we're wanting people to speak as soon as they've heard, and this is great from a teaching perspective, because from a teaching perspective, it shows the real life nature of language. You know, most contexts when we're using language, some contexts we have the ability to listen and to repeat and to hear again, but in most contexts that becomes very wearing. And real-time use of language is really important if you're going to demonstrate your language proficiency. Assessment at trait level, as I said, but everything based on the Common European Framework. So the Common European Framework and the Global Scale of English, they are based around can-do statements. They're based around meaningful communication. What can you do with the language? It's not esoteric. It's practical. And that is the approach that we take at Pearson. Similarly, we have the Global Scale of English, which we've derived from the Common European Framework. That's got lots of learning objectives, which we use and we put into all our tests, put it behind our tests and behind our learning materials, so we can link the learning materials through to the course books and keep them on the same scale, the Global Scale of English. So that's, in truth, the approach to assessment, the multi-trait, multi-item. It's meaning focused, which helps language learning and helps assessment. It's more realistic. It's how language is used. Integrated skills is much more realistic than separating out the skills in a rather false way. It's contextualized, so it's more